Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am here with Stephanie Lepp and Nora Bateson, both second time appearance for both. So Stephanie is going to help me co-host, but we like to run these more as a conversation than anything. So I'll let Stephanie go, sort of run her introduction, and then we'll get started. So welcome, everybody.
Sweet. Thank you, Ashley. Hello, Doomer Optimists. Yes, I'm Stephanie Lepp. I'm the executive producer at the Center for Humane Technology. And we are joined by someone I've been wanting to speak to for a long time, although maybe the conversation has already begun. And that is filmmaker, writer, and educator Nora Bateson. Welcome, Nora.
So nice to be here again. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. And so before I kind of frame up our conversation, I would love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, that's always a question of how to introduce yourself, isn't it?
It is.
Okay, so right now, the way that I would introduce myself is that I am continuing.
That's okay.
I'm going to introduce myself by saying that I am continuing at least 2 generations of the project of advocating for life, making more life. And so what's important to me about that is that I don't feel that I'm holding this in a really individualistic way. So much of what I'm holding is moving through me. Sometimes it comes out of my blood, and then my brain catches up later on. These ideas and this work is not just about writing essays and teaching courses or making films. It's about breakfast, and it's about how you hold your lover, and it's about playing with the dog, and it's about the most intimate, banal moments are also part of this project. And that really happens in this intergenerational way, like an artisan project, over many generations. So that's what I want to say. So right now, that's how I want to frame this. And whether I am an author or a filmmaker or a mom or like a whatever, it's kind of inconsequential, because no matter what I'm doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amen. Amen. Yeah. You just so happen to be maybe doing it in the medium of motherhood at a particular moment, or in the medium of film at another particular moment. I think we're all doing it in the medium of motherhood at this particular moment. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Nora. So I'm going to just lay out some thoughts to kind of frame up the conversation, and then we'll dive in. So the reason I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time is because I've been sitting with this question for a while, this question of, I'm just going to ask it as, what are the epistemological implications of the extent to which everything is connected? Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. I think the answer is yes. Oh, well, maybe this little part should be, we can talk. I mean, I think this part could be edited, but are you asking for a reason?
Just because the phone rang.
Oh, yeah. We can cut that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can cut that out. Okay. And we'll cut this part out too. Yeah. So
yeah.
Okay.
What are the epistemological implications? The answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Start over.
It's all good. Sure, I can re-ask it. Yeah. What are the epistemological implications of the extent to which everything is connected, right? If everything is connected, do we really need to gather all possible data as if that were even possible? Or is there some form of, I call it fractal epistemology because I don't know what to call it, but some form of, like, by knowing one part, or knowing a part that we can know as humans, can we know about, I don't know if the entire thing, but about more of the thing that we are trying to know? And the reason I'm asking these questions is because, we're in a precarious place. We don't necessarily have time to know everything. And, I think we're in an intellectual space together. We're surrounded by, there's a few galaxy brains, shall we say, I'm not going to name any names, but who seem to be in the business of kind of like trying to know as much as possible, as if it's like disconnected from each other or disconnected from us. But I would say it's not even only about time. It's also about knowing being a relationship between the knower and what we're trying to know. And if I were to put it kind of crudely, but in Nora, in your terms, cold data is a cold relationship. Warm data is a warm relationship. How does the way we know affect what we are trying to know? And when we love something and we're in true dialogue with it, maybe it kind of tells us what we need to know in order to kind of like maintain our loving relationship with each other. So I'll just give a couple examples to kind of ground this, and then I'm going to hand it over to you. So the things that kind of come to mind as examples would be, so there's an old book about herbs called The Doctrine of Signatures. I can't say I know very much about it, but something I know, I just remember there being this principle that, if a plant is yellow and it grows by water, it's probably a diuretic. It's like, yeah, we co-evolved. Like, thank you for communicating with me in a language I can understand. If you're yellow and you grow by water, you're probably a diuretic. Thank you for letting me know. Or the Three Sisters, another example. So the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash have been grown together throughout the history of Mesoamerica. And I noticed that in the kind of like scientific literature on the Three Sisters, it's like, oh, wow, what a coincidence. Like those plants grow well together and they give us complementary nutrients. It's like, that's not a coincidence. It's like, it's because they grow well together that they give us compliment. How could it be otherwise? Mm-hmm. That's the way it is. And I'll give one. So it's like, we don't need to know. We didn't need to, or maybe we need, I don't know. There's a question of what do we need to know, maybe, but it tells us, it is telling us what we need to know by growing well together. The last story I'll mention is, there's this amazing story. Sorry, this is going on a little long, but this is the last story I'll share. Okay. So this is, there's this amazing story about foie gras. So foie gras apparently is a naturally occurring phenomenon whereby geese in the fall gorge themselves on dry leaves to prepare for the winter. And so it was this naturally it was just foie gras when we made it at that time of the year, when we killed geese at that time of the year, their livers were delicious. And it was actually the Pharaoh in Egypt who was like, this is so good. I want to be able to eat this year round. And so, forced slaves, like in what other context could this have emerged other than someone having this much power over other people that they could say, hey, you other people, do this horrible thing that's going to be really not fun to do, like force feed leaves into the throats of geese in order to get me this food. So that's how, and so a couple of years ago, there was this, I guess it's like the Olympics for food in France, and foie gras is part of the competition. And there's this one farmer in France who he just has his foie gras. He only produces it in the fall. He just lets the geese do their thing. And so his foie gras is not force fed. It's just when it happens during the year. And he entered his foie gras into the competition, and sustainability is not a criterion. It's all about texture and flavor and whatever it is that we want in foie gras. And he won, and he has won every time, I think. And the judges didn't even know. And to me, that is like, we can even taste what is good on our taste buds. It even tastes better to us. And so I guess what I'd love for you to do is introduce warm data, and then kind of, like run with this inquiry of, what are the epistemological implications of the extent to which everything is connected?
I love that you're asking this, because just in the past few weeks, I've been kind of playing with some not new language around it. There's been a lot of discussion about sense making. And one of the interesting things about this is that there's this idea that the one that is sense making is an individual. And somehow we also have this notion of common sense. And sort of starting to poke around in this realm of questioning, what is in the common sense? If sense making in the commons becomes common sense, it becomes a kind of premises, a kind of foundational set of epistemological processes that are a given, that are grounded, right? We think of common sense as being something grounded, that are grounded in our shared experience. And not so shared experience, but shared experience of the experience, right? So this is stuff like the question, what's in it for me? Right? This is stuff like the question of what can I get out of this? How fast is the productivity going to be? Where is this going? How do I know that what we're doing is going to be worth my time? The notion of my time.
Yeah.
Okay. What do I mean? Okay. Now this one's going to push a button or two. What do I mean when I say I need to keep my boundaries? Okay. So what's in this common sense place? And the thing that is ruminating around what you are bringing in for me is symbiosis. I mean, we have symbiosis in our biology books. We do actually know and talk about it a little bit, but somehow the process of symbiosis didn't completely overhaul our total cultural epistemological common sense, and it should have. I mean, when you start to really look at what the implications are, and you see that this, the tiniest little form of life, the cell, okay, the cell is formed, the organelle is formed through many organisms coming together. There is nothing of you that is an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And this is pretty cliche material. On the one hand, we can say, yeah, we're not individuals and, we're all one. I don't really find that interesting. It's beautiful, but what I'm more intrigued by is the fascination of how this coalescing is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And where did we come from? Who are we? How are we in relationship with the yellow plants by the river and the geese that are swallowing leaves in the fall, right? And so the epistemological implications are actually completely radical.
Yeah.
I mean, this should overhaul education, psychology, history, health, pretty much everything from gardening to engineering. If you actually take symbiosis seriously, what you start to realize is that the sensing is not yours. It's happening through this ancestry of organisms that are coming together and are continuing to. So, are we going to have like an exhaustive map of this? I really hope not. There are some that might try, but that would never be where I would want to go with it. For me, it's not really about the exhaustive, volumes of listing the connective properties. That is just tedious, and also irrelevant in a way, because what is important is the approach to the perception. If I'm looking for the outline of the individual organisms, guess what I'm going to find? And if I'm looking for the ways in which these organisms are constantly shaping each other, I'm going to be looking in another way. The whole scope and approach and aesthetic of inquiry changes. So, is there such a thing as an individual? Kinda. But is that useful in terms of, how we're going to live together, how we're going to be in relationship with the world around us? And that is the issue, is that there is a common sense metaphor that of individualism, of separatedness, of productivity, efficiency, all of these things that came, fully into focus with industrialism, but they were probably brewing before then. And it's really hard to get out.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
I would jump in there because I would say part of the frame of this podcast seems to be recognizing that we're in a really strange point in human history where a lot of us are like peak oil, like a historical materialist type thinkers, and we think about how this injection of cheap energy made it so that we were able to like stop paying attention to or being close enough to our interconnectedness. We were able to offshore it or to outsource it or to externalize it to the point that we lost the knowledge necessary for like the functioning of that interdependence, if that makes sense. So the knowledge about the plants by the river was lost because, we just got diuretics somewhere else in a factory far away, and that we didn't need to know it anymore. So then we lost that. And so I think for a lot of us, the interest is in re-embracing the interconnectedness, common sense. And I think for a lot of us, the warm data perspective is really helpful because, like you were saying before just now, Nora, I think there is something where that totally flows from, enlightenment, rationality, industrialism, that says something like humans are so brilliant and the human brain is so singularly powerful that we can basically control and manipulate nature for our ends. And so then we ask questions in a way that kind of determines the answer in advance. So like some of this cold data scientific questions, we're asking questions in a way that like doesn't allow for the fullness of context to enter in, or the fullness of the interdependence. So I guess we could just riff a little bit on, and I know this is a lot of your work, I guess trying to re-embrace the commons, common sense, interdependence with others and nature, but then avoiding the pitfalls of like, who do you trust in this world? I mean, all of us are so disconnected that I do think there is like a tendency to go toward the galaxy brain who is beginning to talk about the interdependence, but maybe not in a way that's like tangible for your own sphere. like practical in your own life. They're talking about it in a way that's like everything's interconnected throughout all of history, and everyone's watching these analyses that are like, wow, yeah, that's right. But still, for me, there's a scale disconnect for like a lot of us, where we're trying to answer questions that are relevant for our own lives. Like literally, how do I manage my work environment so that I'm able to breastfeed my baby to the extent that she needs to, this kind of thing. As opposed to like, how did the Romans handle collapse? Like, so anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, I think a big one in my house. One of the sort of cornerstones of my measurement of exploration around systems change and epistemological shiftings is in the relationship between parent and child, particularly around getting the dishes done. Okay, so this is some kind of place where there's a transmission that's taking place between the generations, and there's a lot of interesting pushbacks and questions about learning and questions about practicality and authority and so on and so forth. One of the things that we do in our households is we make chore wheels, or we put up lists for whose day it is to do dishes. And in the same way that buying that diuretic medication obscured the ability to perceive the relationships on the creek bed, so too does the chore wheel obscure the ability to perceive the relationships in the family. Mm. Right? You don't really care if your child does dishes on Wednesday. Mm. What's important is that they are beginning to be able to perceive when you're tired and can't do it, when they need to kick in, not because it's their turn. That's really pretty irrelevant, actually, but because their family needs them. And maybe before it's a full tilt breakdown need. Maybe if it's like, yeah, my mom's been working all day, I can do this. I just have been hanging out. And that thinking is so different than it's Wednesday, it's my night. So yeah. I am only going to wash the dishes tonight because tomorrow it's no longer Wednesday. Right? And this is it's obscuring the possibility of perceiving the territory. It's a map and territory
need to be done. Perceiving that the dishes are dirty and need to be cleaned.
and what's happening in the relationships in the house.
Yeah.
And so this is something at this very practical, day in, day out place where we are actually teaching the next generation not to pay attention to the very relationships that we're then telling them they have to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And it's madness.
It's madness. I also I tend to be, as Ashley knows, like an all of the above kind of person. So I mean, can we hold both? Can we do both? Can we put both in their rightful place? Like, in a way, part of me is, and maybe we'll get to this later, but there's part of me that's also just a little bit like, thank God we gave birth to so many ways of doing things. We're just overusing some of them, but thank God for all of them. I mean, they all, and some of them we may never, ever, ever need again. But I mean, gosh, there's so many directions I want to go. I do want to go back to, I love that you brought up education, because I do think that is part of where this rubber meets the road, is how are we teaching ourselves to know about the world? And specifically, I think the specific area that I would kind of focus on is, how do we teach ourselves to understand what is a solution? What is a systemic solution to the problems we face? And are you familiar with the concept of synergistic satisfiers?
A little bit, yeah. And
go ahead.
Why don't you
Yeah, you
explain
should say what it
everybody
is.
who's listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So this concept was developed by a Chilean economist named Manfred Max Neef, and it's a name for phenomena that solve multiple quote unquote different problems, or
Mhm.
so we think they're different, simultaneously or synergistically. So the three sisters would be an example. Oh, wow. They complement each other in the soil and they give us complementary nutrients. Or breastfeeding, which, is valuable for the mom and the baby physically, psychologically, economically. I mean, it
Mhm.
solves multiple quote unquote different problems synergistically. And I would go as far as to say if something does not solve multiple problems, quote unquote, simultaneously, it shouldn't be considered a solution. It shouldn't be a solution at all. And so that's kind of where when I say fractal epistemology, I don't know if I'm going to stick with that term, but it's like if you already see it, if you already see it doing helpful things, I don't know, at least two scales, like through your eyes and through a microscope, or if you're already seeing something, a pattern of solving that is happening at multiple levels of organization simultaneously, like it's working.
Yeah, I like that.
And I think we can predict that. I think that will tell us, like, we could have known Facebook. We could have known so many things because they tell us what we need to know at multiple levels of organization, including through our eyeballs.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is that almost everything is happening in multiple contexts simultaneously. So the illusion that we can pull things out of those multi-contextual realms and somehow solve for dishes. Okay.
Yeah, one at a time.
All right.
Yeah, everything else just stop while I do this little thing over here.
Is very industrial. Okay,
Yeah.
this is a machine-like way of looking. And so I think, yeah, breastfeeding is a great example. I use that example too to describe basically every single one of the Sustainable Development Goals in one image.
That's awesome.
Right? So you don't need 17 colorful cubes to tell you what what we need to do.
Yeah.
The image of a mother breastfeeding her child is clean water, clean air. It's going to need to be, genders are going to have to be respecting each other. We're going to have to take care of the oceans. There's going to have to be soil cared for. There's education. We're going to have to feed the babies. The people who feed the babies have to be able to feed their babies, and the babies are going to need to be able to feed their babies. And so that's the whole picture. It's right there.
Yeah.
It's right there. And somehow it's much more familiar in all kinds of meta communications to make a grid of 17 different colored boxes. And so the important thing is to pay attention to that meta communication and recognize this is the culture into which this communication is going. This is what the appetite is for the familiar. To look and feel and be like this is an invitation for a particular kind of action, a particular kind of pushing the levers and the buttons, right? When you see 17 boxes, you can create billions of dollars of committees and projects, right? And there is an action plan.
Yeah.
When you see a mother breastfeeding her child and you say, okay, there's the project. Most people are going to be like, so what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Right?
Create the conditions conducive to breastfeeding.
Right. What's the doing? And so this is where solutioning for me in systemic ways has to be beyond first order. It has to be beyond, right? So you make a chore wheel to get the dishes done. Dishes get done. Problem solved. Wrong. Problem is not solved. All right, because that was a first order solution.
Yeah.
And if you are wanting to, because you have to do multiple things at the same time, right? So the thing is that we actually are doing multiple things. We're just, half the things we're doing are creating the problems we're trying to solve.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they are doing multiple things. The chore wheel, it is there, but it's teaching something that is plugging into a very strong, potent epistemological framework of efficiency and doing and separating and reductionism and the individual. Right? So we have to be super careful when we start playing with that fire. We can play with it, but we better know that we're playing with fire when we play with it.
Yeah, and know that it's maybe training wheels on our way to somewhere, and we got to learn how to let them go. We got to teach ourselves to ride a two-wheeler eventually.
Yeah. And maybe it's training wheels for how to, clock in and out of an office building.
Which is something maybe we don't really want to, all do forever. Maybe knowing how to do it can be helpful sometimes. I am curious, and I
go
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was just, this is a very just on this point. Like, I'm just curious. I was just wondering if we might kind of imagine what would be the kind of warm data, fractal epistemology, I don't know, like version of the chore. Of the chore wheel.
Before you answer that question, Nora, I just want to say, I was at a talk recently, I don't remember where it was, where they were talking about kids, when they were learning to ride a bike, they had training wheels, which are two little wheels that catch you if you fall. So you just can be off balance and you just keep getting caught. And now they've invented this thing called a balance bike that has no training wheels, but it has no pedals. And the kids kind of just push themselves with their feet and they learn how to balance themselves on those two wheels on the balance bike, which then gets them comfortable to get onto a regular bike, and no training wheels are involved at all. And I just think that was such a perfect metaphor to bring up, because that
is a perfect metaphor.
Yeah, the balance bike as a tool, it uses the same kind of balancing mechanism
that you're going to need,
right? As opposed to the other one that has like a false sense of security that doesn't really teach you the skill needed to balance on a two-wheeler bike. So what is the chore version?
Totally. What is the balance bike chore wheel? Yeah.
I mean, for me, what that was saying, hey, come and do this with me. I don't want to do it alone. Can you come help me? But I'll tell you that we just had this warm data retreat at my house, and we brought all these warm data hosts who'd been through all these trainings things, 40 house guests.
Lots of dishes.
Lots of dishes. And no chore wheel, no list of responsibilities.
Yeah.
And very purposefully, set out to say, look, there's no list, so pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And
how did it go?
It was incredible. It was incredible. I mean, and when people did their turn, they did it till it shined, and and nobody overdid it, and nobody underdid it, and.
Was it all grown-ups? Was there kids involved?
Well, to tell you the truth, it's easier with kids.
Because they make it fun.
Well, because they are not addicted to the chore wheel. They hate the chore wheel. And the grown-ups, well, who's going to take responsibility? What if nobody takes responsibility? What's going to happen? The fear of like letting go of this thing was so tangible, but it was fine.
Yeah. You know what that reminds me of? So when we have student groups come here to Uruguay, they're undergrads and, young enough, pliable. And when they come here, we have them work alongside small scale family farmers. And those farmers have kids who are usually running around when they're on the land. And when the undergraduates come, we also bring our kids. And it's like on purpose, we want to show them that there is a kind of part of life where everybody isn't institutionalized, where instead you have to get interrupted constantly. And there's like this flow between, your responsibilities as a parent and the work you're trying to do in your vocation. There's a way to integrate the two, but then there are times in which they're separate. And so we say to them explicitly, like, the farmers are helping us set up volunteer tasks for you all to do. But that means that their attention, if they're teaching you things, gets taken away from their children. So we're asking you to be intuitive and to notice that and to help out with the kids and play with them when it's appropriate. And it's great. And the students love it. I mean, they love like that they're coming to this other country and, some of their volunteer time is just playing with, a 3-year-old in the dirt.
That's awesome.
But also, I think it doesn't actually take that much to reacquaint our own intuition. But you do need the right circumstances, I think. And I think about like your house, Nora, when the students come here, I rail against this because online all the time, people want an action plan. They want the 17 sustainable development goal boxes. And that's almost the enemy to what we're trying to suggest, but it's also very hard to say in words because so much of it is intuitive. It's almost just like you have to show, not tell. So that is a little bit of a limitation, just because a lot of times we're trying to communicate across to many people at once. We're communicating across distance. We're communicating with text. All of it is very disembodied. So I wonder if you have some thoughts about that, Nora, how to like bring back this intuitive sense,
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, this conversation is really important because what we're talking about is being really careful with these abstractions and the addiction to the models and to the idea of a kind of action and productivity that's predetermined. And I mean, I'm with you. I see this all over the place and I'm like, ooh, that's not going to go anywhere good. And I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm being negative and I'm, here's all these people doing all this great work and I'm just going to poo-poo it. And who am I? And then, give it 3 years and they're scratching their heads going, well, we don't know what happened to that $30 million or $30 billion or, and I'm like, this thing was never going to work. And they're like, well, why not? But they still don't really want to know that in order to do systemic work, you have to make the space for the relationships to come into play and to start to work on into each other so that they make new relationships. So it makes new relationships. So it makes new relationships. And it's nth order change that you're after, and you're never going to trace it back. It's never going to happen. If you're doing real systemic work, you won't know it with a graph, but you will know it completely because you will see that there is vitality. Something is happening, but the something is not here. It's not there. It's not here. It's not there. It's in it. Just like, when you walk into a doctor's office or a school and the culture is bad, it's bad everywhere. Okay. It's bad at the reception desk. It's bad in the classroom, bad at the board. It's something icky that's gone through all of it. Right. And, so, but let's go back to that because, Stephanie, you brought in this word knowing, and I think this is a really interesting word. And somehow it gets paired with uncertainty as a kind of, well, we know this, or we're uncertain, or we're ambiguous. And I think, what I have seen with warm data work is that the way in which experiences seem to season and shape and intone our previous experiences. Are you following? So
everything matters.
And there's
it's
like a
really
scaffolding.
interesting. Yeah. It's interesting to recognize that it's ongoing, and everything you know about foie gras, for example, is going to be shifted by the next time you eat foie gras.
Thank God, as it should be. Yeah.
And right. So this knowing thing is not a static state. And so that means that you don't actually know. You're in the process of knowing. Right. And so uncertainty and ambiguity must be part of that. They're not in separate categories. So this works for and against us, though, I think. And so this isn't just a beautiful thing. So much of the way in which we have experienced life up to this moment shapes the way you hear what I'm saying, or the way you're sitting in your chair, or the way you're digesting the last meal you had, right? So there's a lot of history and sort of the ancestry of experience that's like a cauldron into which every new moment is dropped, right? And when people start thinking, well, what we need is, imagination or innovation, and then they source that from the same cauldron. And so the new idea is laced, is woven, is carved in the same grain of wood as the existing epistemology that it's trying to change. So how do we get to a place where the common sense, okay, that sense that we're making together, is shifting? When each of us turns up with a cauldron of our own experience. And so this is what is happening in a warm data lab, is that there's multiple contexts and the exploration of a question that is at a particular level of abstraction from the contexts. Okay, it's not just any question. So these things that we're talking about here, about the model and the dishes, or they have a relationship to each other, and that relationship spins out into all kinds of communication.
Yeah.
Right. And so you want to be super careful what's in that gap.
Yeah.
Because in that gap is where that living part of you that will make connections, that does make connections, because that's all you can do is make connections and see relationships because you're a living thing, will make really dangerous connections. So it can go bad. And we see this in, well, I mean, honestly, just to take the gloves off, a good deal of the media is just filled with pieces of information that have been completely decontextualized, that then you and I, because we're living creatures, contextualize into our own lives and turn them into craziness. And suddenly we're talking about, immigration, and immigration is about people who are coming to take away your way of life or something. It has, and all the context of the fact that you've been buying really cheap blue jeans for 50 years.
Yeah.
Right?
I've long had an idea that, like, for one edition of the New York Times, they should just show how all of the stories are connected.
Yeah.
This one about, like corn subsidies is related to the obesity story in the other side of the paper. Just like that's the addition of the paper, is how
Yeah.
all of our stories are connected to
Once
each
a
other.
year, just give us one day a year.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, is that there's there's a way in which you can make connection between these stories that opens up and expands into the premises of symbiosis, okay, into this ability to start perceiving how things are coming together. There's another way that you can do it that naturalizes and justifies and creates all sorts of havoc.
Yeah.
And so it's really a tricky one.
Well, that's why I kind of initially, or I'm now thinking of, or I have been thinking of knowing as a relationship, right, between the knower and what is being known, which is already a distinction we're just kind of deciding to make here. Or we can use that distinction sometimes when it's useful, and if we're wanting to have a loving relationship, what does knowing look like? What does knowing become when we want to have a loving relationship with what we're trying to know, what we're trying to understand? It can look very different. And then we don't need, then those like exhaustive maps or those like 17 boxes, they become like, I don't know, maybe interesting works of art. Like we don't necessarily need them. No offense to art, but if we're just saying art is like something we created for fun, like it can just be like this thing we created for fun. Like look at these fun 17 boxes. It's like that's colorful and cool. Not necessarily that I need it, or not that it's I guess for me the pressure kind of comes back to like we're in a precarious place. How do we know in a way that, or how do we make our map just good enough, knowing the map is not the territory? How do we make it just good enough that we can continue moving in the right direction together? And how do we know when it's good enough that that's kind of all we need to move in the right direction?
I think there are some people who are more sort of accustomed to swimming in that kind of water.
Yeah.
I think everybody can do it. But particularly people who are caught in a context that is pushing productivity are going to have a hard time with that knowing, because it's pushing the action before the readying. I just wrote this essay that's out there on readying. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that, but it's basically I put it together with a team of people. It's looking at change from a very different place. Instead of looking at what's the problem and let's find the solution to the problem and take action, it's basically producing a readying. How do you produce a readying so that the possibility, and start there. And then instead of saying where it should go or what the optimum goals could be, allow those possibilities to unfurl themselves. And so what does that mean? What does that actually take? And it takes a nourishment of that possibility of making connections between lots of different processes. A few won't do. If you have a reduced number of processes that you're making connections between, you get craziness. But if you have lots of them, you don't have to make an exhaustive map, but you have to start to see. You have to feel, you have to taste, you have to sense that, that the education system is not just about school, right? It's about identity. It's about economy. It's about health. It's about family. It's about culture. It's about history. It's about technology. It's about, right? It's like, it's not just about how you, as a responsible parent, get your kid out the door at 8 in the morning. and who they will be, so that they fit into a system that you spend your day trying to actually change. Right. So this transcontextual basis is really important, because it opens up the room in which those connections get made. And I think that's the big one. So in the readying, what you want to do is allow for that. So what you're doing, for example, with your farm, is that you're bringing in family, you're bringing in food, you're bringing in soil, you're bringing in cross-cultural language questions are coming in. You've got lots of things happening at the same time. And that's good.
Yeah, I was just thinking this, the business we've made is hosting these trips, and on the surface it just sounds like, an educational study abroad opportunity for undergraduates, but we really have worked to build out the structure of the institution of our school to allow for emergence, and to be sensitive to, I guess, the desires of every party involved. So I like teaching. It's built around me being able to teach. The people we're working with, the farmers, they like to have help, volunteer help, and they also like to share their culture. The students like to experience nature, the farm. They like to learn about these things. They like the cross-cultural experience. So everybody involved, we're sensitive to their desires, but then you set up something that's like institutionally set up to be flexible and to allow for emergence. So when they first came, we didn't know, we didn't really have a curriculum outside, we're going to have these experiences and then we're going to talk about it. And what I learned is that the students ended up noticing, I was telling Nora before we started, a lot of the social dynamics, even more so than the environmental ones too, but the way in which people work together. And so we, build the curriculum talking about, this interdependence and social dynamics. But I guess my question then is, I've been thinking a lot recently about appropriate scale. And I think it's really hard to go to like a Peter Thiel type and say, build an institution for me that allows for emergence. Like the scale's just too big, and we're so used to profit maximizing and so used to like thinking in terms of X, Y, and Z result, as opposed to like allowing some sort of scale for emergence. And my school is my husband and I, like it's the right scale, excuse me, it's the right scale for us. We're flexible, we're adaptable, we're also in a marriage, so we can talk to each other and say like, this is working, this isn't. Once you get to even like 15 employees or 100 employees, like, allowing those, you can't be as adaptable with this scale. So I'm just thinking about your example with, reading the mainstream media, New York Times, it's like Neil Postman, like everything's out of context. If you recontextualize and you do it at the right scale, this meso scale, I think there's possibilities there. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. I mean, honestly, I almost feel like people could make some sort of initiatives, programs, businesses, but at this scale where that allows for like emergent flexibility and like following intuition. But I do think the meso scale is necessary too, because you can't just be on your own figuring this out. It does require some interaction with other people, and it's better as it scales up, more impactful, gives people more opportunities to slot in.
Yeah. And I think it's really dangerous to come up with a model of how we're going to save the world. I think that's probably the most dangerous thing we could do, because that model is going to hurt people. It's going to make them angry. It's going to isolate them. They're going to be so mad. They're going to not see their complexity in that model, and they're going to be left out, and they're going to feel like the model is not made for them. The same way you feel when but times 1,000, when you call a number and it says push 1 for this and 2 for that and 3 for the other thing and 4 for this, and you're like, yeah, but that's not what I'm calling for. Right? And it's like, you know, and you get angry, but you also get sad. Like, where am I in this world? Where is my experience? And so this thing of scale somehow has to be able to hold the possibility of the complexity that each person has. And this is something that we see in warm data all the time. Because, you know, I spent years trying to teach systems thinking and complexity. And one of the reasons I developed the Warm Data Lab was because I just realized I wasn't getting anywhere. And people were learning vocabulary for the, you know, it didn't attach to their lives. And for me, in my household growing up, systems were not things you drew on the board. Systems were, you know, what was happening in the fish tank and what was happening in the family, and what was, you know, it was something wild and alive and juicy and weird and unnameable. But that wasn't what I was seeing when I went out in the world and started looking at what was being taught as complexity. And I realized, you know, the name is not the thing named, and the complexity is not in the vocabulary of complexity. It's in life. And so when I was working on the Warm Data Lab, what I was hoping was that everybody in the process would begin to understand complexity, not by some model on the board, but through the complexity of their own lives. And essentially, every time you hear someone tell a story from their life, it's transcontextual. Any story you tell is going to have culture and family and money and God and, you know, history and tech, and it's all going to be in there in one way or another, because life is actually moving through all of those all the time. So the way in which groups that come out of this start to form questions, the questions are so different than what they might have going into that. So I think, you know, yeah, just in terms of working with communities, it changes the direction entirely of where projects start.
So I think you just kind of helped me understand how, like, I maybe there's kind of like three kind of ways of knowing or ways of understanding here that one is this like reductionist, contextless, what we read in the news. Okay. Another one is like everything, fire hose, all of the information, everything possible, which is, and then what I'm wondering is if there's this possibility of like just a few data points at different scales of organization that tell you the pattern. That's like what the Three Sisters, it's like, it works in my diet, it works in the earth, like it works in an infinity of other ways. Maybe I can't like choose, you know, as long as I get 3 or something, then I've gotten the pattern of something that like I want to move in that direction, maybe. But and I guess I just want to tie this to like, okay, so if we're going to make this real, like what would be this kind of a way of knowing about, you know, if we're like thinking about the complex problems we talk about, COVID, climate. Okay, let's take climate. Okay, the climate crisis manifests itself obviously not just in the atmosphere, in our lungs, in our gardens, you know, in our floods, fires, wars. Like it manifests itself in so many places, in so many ways that we can all read and understand and act on. And so maybe to ask this in kind of like a blasphemous way, like to what extent do we need climate change? The idea of climate, to what extent do we need climate science? I don't even know how to ask this. To what extent do we even need that in order to take appropriate climate action? Like, is there a way of just like, do we even need the term climate science? I don't know. Is that crazy to
Well,
ask?
I have actually, I like wrote and published an academic paper on this specific topic. So I wanted to jump
great.
in because
Please.
I literally interviewed people who lived around in and around Chicago, people in the city and people in the rural area who produced at least 50% of their own food. And just interviewed them about it. And basically, the city people did it for climate change, but the rural people, a lot of them don't even believe that climate change is anthropogenic. But they're doing the exact same actions because they want clean food, and they care about soil health and they care about pollution. A lot of them are like conservationist hunter and fisherman types, and so it was like I wrote this paper that was basically like, there's a way bigger environmental movement that we're not seeing because these people are like blasphemous because they don't agree to the doctrine of climate science, but in action they're doing the same. So it's,
And isn't that what we want? I mean, like, what is the purpose of knowing? Like, obviously there's knowledge for knowledge's sake, and that can be beautiful, and the 17 boxes, and put them on the wall and frame it if you want to.
Yeah.
But ultimately we're trying to know things, I mean, in order to do things, in order to like do things and live well and live together and live harmoniously and make the game more infinite to the extent that we can. And so yeah, it's like, I don't need to, I guess, just in response to, yeah, it's like, it's all good with me if people don't, it's like, if they don't if they don't know in the same way that I know, or they don't conclude the same thing that I conclude, if the actions that we're taking are the rightful actions. Yeah, well, I want to let Nora respond
let
too.
Nora go.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we have again made a map territory mistake. Because the climate crisis is a consequence. It's not the problem; it's the consequence.
Mm.
And so, how many climate conferences have I been to where no one mentioned the family? Where people were all dressed up in suits and standing at podiums and signaling all the same cultural signals of personal identity and credibility, but trying to talk about the climate crisis as being the problem. And I mean, I think prestige is the problem. The whole way we think about success or what makes you credible or believable, that's an issue that is feeding climate change. The particulate in the sky and the chemicals in the soil are coming from this epistemic situation of wanting to be in control, of wanting to scale things up, of wanting to make higher levels of productivity. And so then we come in to the climate crisis and say we need to scale this up and have a higher level of productivity to address climate change. But that's exactly the thinking that's creating it. And so the ecological thinking, the symbiosis thinking, that those premises are going to move, they're going to shape, they're going to walk, talk, smell so different than what we know of as taking action toward a linear goal. Mm. And this is something, I mean, I'm sure that someone listening is going to want to chop my head off for saying this right now. But this, I mean, I don't know how else to say it anymore. That this is not, we can't address this with linear problem solving. It's how we got into it.
Yeah. I mean, I'll reassure you that almost all of our listeners are very sick of that approach, and that's why they found us. They really, a lot of people, I came up with this term, just frustrated, on Twitter, spreadsheet brain. And it's like
Mm.
the spreadsheet brain is the enemy of doomer optimism. We all realize that. A lot of people in this sphere are like putting their hands in the soil, but also re-embracing. I mean, I think of breastfeeding as such a perfect example. Like, imagine going to a climate conference and giving a speech about breastfeeding as a way of meeting all of the sustainable development goals. It would make people's heads explode, even though it's really just part of you have to make it so that a woman is held in a community,
Yes,
in a space,
across generations,
interdependent.
Yeah.
And that's how it works.
Yeah.
So all of those things get solved at once, if you make that, but the whole system has to support for that one action to be possible.
Right, totally. Which is why, so it's like if the task at hand was create the conditions conducive to moms being able to breastfeed their children, then, if that was the thing we're all organized around, although me being the yes and all of the above, it's like, under what circumstances can spreadsheet brain be helpful? Are there a few? Are there any? I imagine there might be one.
Fewer.
Fewer, exactly. And that's the more important point. Fewer.
And just knowing when to use it. And when not.
Knowing when to use it and knowing it's not the only way.
And the tendency is to try to use it for everything.
For everything. But isn't that what we do with every new tool we invent? Like that I think is it would be the shift, because when we come up with a new tool, we're like, this is the best, this is the best, this is the one and only, we should use it for. But using it for everything is how we discover what it's useful for and what it's not useful for. Mm-hmm. And so the shift to me would be like assuming it's not going to work for everything, like trying it without the dogma. We're experimenting with this thing, like, does it work here? No. Here, yes, cool. And I think that would like kind of take the edge off this co-evolution that we're doing with our tools. We just assume like it's not going to be useful for everything, but let's discover it, let's explore it, let's play with it, let's not get too attached to it.
I mean, if you want to know what systems change looks like, look at the late 1800s, because that was when we got a serious systems change. Mm-hmm. And in that period of time, sort of 1850 to 1898 or something, everything changed. And this idea of high productivity and the factory started to reflect the schools and the health system, and the word economics happened, and statistics happened, and statistics and eugenics were connected. And I mean, it was about control and bettering and optimizing and efficiency and measuring. And in order to do that, everything had to get pulled out of context. You can't measure something in context. Just think about that for a second. You can't measure it in context, because
you have to stop it. You have to stop it from like being alive in order to like.
Well, and you have to take it out of the multiplicity of relationships. If you ask the question, how big is a grasshopper? And you measure that grasshopper and you're like, the grasshopper is 1.5 inches, or it's 2.5 centimeters, or whatever you want to call that. That is locked in a particular way of looking. It is not actually, a grasshopper is not actually 2.5 centimeters, right? The grasshopper, if you ask the mites, how big is a grasshopper? Or you ask the trees, how big is a grasshopper? Or the earthworms, or the bacteria, or right? So the measurement is going to be locked in one particular way of knowing.
Or the grasshopper's life cycle, it's growing.
Exactly.
Time.
Right. Or the tree might also say that information, quote unquote, is not relevant to me or is not important to me. Go have fun with it if you want to. With your 17 cubes.
So we are getting into trouble by forgetting that our perception is just a perception.
Well,
Well,
I
Nora,
think,
I want to ask
oh yeah,
you.
you go
Oh
ahead.
no, go
I
ahead.
was gonna, yeah, I was gonna say, I was gonna go back to a question you and I talked about before, when we were organizing this. So you go, and I can follow up if need be.
Well, this is just so, you have said, and I hear you, we cannot, right? The way that the kind of thinking that got us into this mess is not going to get us out. And so if we continue to use this way of thinking, and I also hear this, I don't know, maybe I'm mishearing, but kind of turning this spreadsheet brain or decontextualization into a wrong way of doing things. And my kind of sense, or this is just kind of how I am, at least right now at this moment in time, is to instead of making it wrong. I mean, some things I can make wrong, but more often than is it right or wrong is just to ask the question, under what circumstances or in what context would it be helpful, or would it be fun, or would it be enjoyable or equitable or useful? And so yeah, I do. Do you think that there are no circumstances under which asking the question, how long is a grasshopper, and having the answer be 2.5 inches, like, is there no circumstance under which that would ever be a worthwhile activity? Or is it,
The trick
yeah,
is that we could do that and we could have that measurement, but we just have to remember that it's just a perception. And that's the part
yeah,
where it gets toxic. It would be fine if we were
okay,
able to use these
hold
things
it hold
and
it
say,
loosely.
okay, but that's just
Yeah,
that. Now, what about all this warm data that's here also?
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
But that is not the trickery of this is that it's
Hmm.
like telling someone you don't be racist.
Yeah,
You can't just tell people that, because the place in which that racism is living is below, under, wrapped in insidious little corners of experience and ways of living in their lives that they aren't even aware of.
yeah.
So
I
the
mean,
same
yeah,
thing is true with industrialism.
Mhm.
It's
yes,
deeply insidious. It's like heroin. And you have to be super careful when you play with it, because if you're trying to work with complexity and living systems, that's such a we're not used to that yet. And we're unwieldy with it. And
yeah,
every time we blink an eye, this thing sneaks back in, and someone
yes.
with all the best intentions creates 17 sustainable development goals. I am absolutely 100% certain that they knew they were doing the right thing.
Yep. This
Yes.
is my sense too.
100%.
Yep.
And so,
Yes.
but this thing, this eugenics, it sneaks in.
Yep.
And
Yes.
yeah.
And yes. And then I would say, so yes. And may we not be as totalizing with, our next thing, may we also see it as just the latest thing, the next thing, the next thing that will also be provisional and also evolve, like, may we hold the next thing a little looser so that it too can continue to evolve, or we too can continue to co-evolve with it.
I
That's where I absolutely think this next thing is this, undetermined nth order, nourishing the conditions, the readying of what can happen. Without it's very loose in its holding.
and oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say this is a really tricky question. Okay. And I know that I'm being kind of binary about this, but I also just want to be provocative and say, is there a moment when a little bit of eugenics is okay with you?
Right.
I'm going to answer that.
Like,
yeah.
No, it's not okay. And how, especially when we don't know what we're doing. And so this is a provocative thing. And it's really hard to be in the world that we are in. And having grown up into the language and the education system and the understanding of, science, I come from a family of scientists. So I love science, and I don't really have a problem with measuring grasshoppers. But what I do have a problem with is
deciding that is
the underlying epistemic premises from which the questions that get pursued are taking place, from which actions are derived.
I mean, I would go further. I told this to Stephanie. We talked that I sometimes tend to on purpose rhetorically swing farther in the opposite direction just to kind of pull the conversation toward the middle. And I think that there's some value to that rhetorically, just because so much is going in one direction. It's nice to be this lone voice that then can sort of bring people into the discussion. And then, then once we have a more nuanced discussion, we can meet in the middle. But like an example I can think of is in the name of climate smart agriculture, peasant agriculturalists in Africa who live in balance and produce in balance with nature, enough food for everybody to eat, but they aren't producing the maximum yields according to what can be measured, are being taken off of their land in favor of like drones and machines in the name of climate smart agriculture. And I see this kind of thing even here in my context in Uruguay. So it's like there is a point at which the measurement itself is destructive, because what you decide to measure can determine what is of worth. And so the agroecological producers, they're really hard to measure in some ways because it's complex. It changes through seasons. The yields are not all standardized. A lot of times you're running animals in through with plants and like they're stacking different production methods, as opposed to a field that's all planted with one thing and the yields are all standardized and measurable and comparable across the world. This is an example that like illustrates the point of how it can be violence to choose what to measure. But then the positive side I see is I'm friends with a couple of these people on Twitter who are like young men frustrated by the way science works, but also like extremely interested in esoteric like anthropology, entomology, plant science. And so they hold science in this kind of like light way, like they want to know the names of things according to science. They know all these different plant species, but then they spend a lot of time out in nature just cataloging things and noticing things and taking pictures of them. I feel super hopeful for this younger generation where like maybe there is a swing back. And I don't know if either of you have any interaction with these younger generation, but I think there is a potential there.
I mean, I have to just be perfectly honest with you that in the course on warm data, there's a whole section that we talk about the relationship between reductionism and complexity and holism and how important that is. Okay, so I may be giving off this impression, but it
Love
is
that.
important that we have both. And
Yes.
we have to be able to zoom in and look at things, and we have to be able to zoom out and see how they are in relationship. The problem is that when we pull things out of context, we don't usually put them back.
Yes. Yes.
And so my dream, of course, is to explore what questions does a more warm data approach bring to reductionist science? Like, how might the questions be changed if they're born in another way of thinking instead of the other way around? So very often I find that we're taking reductionist versions of problems and trying to solve them with systemic thinking, as opposed to taking systemic thinking and then coming up with questions that we can then use reductionism to inform. And that's a I think we're just have a future where we can begin to ask really different questions. And I think the question of the breastfeeding is the perfect example, right? How do we make the future, viable for breastfeeding? Because actually mammals have to feed their young. So how do we feed the babies? It's the most basic. I have a whole little thing on feed the babies, but it's the most basic question. How do you feed the babies? And if you ask that question, then all this other stuff gets brought in a very different way. Not that it's not there.
The fact that you talk about, or you teach about the relationship or collaboration between reductionism and systems thinking, I love that. You are speaking my love language. When I last came on Do More Optimism, we talked about, I call it synthetic strategy because I don't know what else to call it, but it's the question of under what circumstances is what way, well, actually it's more is what way helpful, and which ways do we prefer more than others, and how might we collaborate between the different ways. I mean, I'm just thinking of my favorite scene in Avatar is when Jake is he's flying the pterodactyl, but he has the machine gun. It's like there's the industrial GI transformer thing, and then there's the swarm intelligence, I don't remember the names and they're kind of fighting each other, and then Jake swoops in on the pterodactyl, the swarm intelligence but with the machine gun. He's got both forms of intelligence, and so anyway, I get excited when I hear about because we have more ingredients to work with. We get to make more interesting things, new things we've never made. Okay, but so last question for you, because we're running out of time. Last question for you is about the idea of context. Because that too, we could say there's no difference between shallow ecology and deep ecology, and we could say shallow ecology when people are a part of their ecosystem, because then there is no earth for its own sake, because we are a part of taking care of the ecosystem is taking care of ourselves. And I just wonder, is there, when you think about context, I guess there's a way in which context is itself a shifting, what we call the context, and there's a way in which I don't even know what do you think of there's a way in which when I am in, let's say, a loving relationship with my context or what I'm trying to know, the distinction kind of disappears, and then it's just us in a process of kind of collective self-discovery, you could say. I was curious how you think about the concept of context, maybe, and if that you think of it in a kind of non-dual way, or how do you think about the concept of context?
If I could just add to that, this is what I was going to ask as my final question too. So let's just tack them together, because I think it's just very similar. I think I don't want to get too woo-woo about it, but sometimes you need to. There is something to love here, and I think love being care and attention and interaction in just a holding place, where knowing in the context of love makes a sort of different outcome, as opposed to knowing in the context of utilization, exploitation, fixing, solving, I think controlling. So yeah, I wonder, I don't know if we want to, I think ending on this would be good, but if we want to go very to the woo end, we're three women, there is something in the feminine that has love in it. And I think if I think about the breastfeeding example, it's an instinct for love that's, fundamentally caring in nature. It's not because somebody told me I can save this amount of money breastfeeding. You know what I mean?
Totally.
That just makes no sense. It's because I see my infant turn toward my breast when she's born and open her mouth to suckle. there's an animal instinct, and the instinct is based in love and mutual care and interdependence. So I wonder, yeah, if you have some thoughts on that, the love question.
Awesome.
I think that what is in a context is relationships between lots of different organisms or things that are happening, lots of different relationships. And that context, let's say it's a jungle. It's not in the trees, and it's not in the insects, and it's not in the soil. But it's in the relationship between them, and so it's a kind of an inconvenient thing to note, but relationships are made of communication. And so first, we might get caught thinking we're going to change the parts of the jungle. We've got to fix the trees. We've got to fix the soil. We've got to fix the insects. We've got to fix the reptiles. We've got to fix right? Then we might say, it's the relationships. We got to tend to these relationships. But what's in the relationships is communication. And I think one of the things that I'm so interested in is not controlling or limiting or scripting communication, but asking the question, what's it possible to communicate? Which is really a different question than what is being communicated. So what's implicit in that question, what's it possible to communicate, is that there are limits. And those limits, they don't have to, this is not a bad thing. Okay. The limits that create jungles, or limits that create oceans, limits that create families. It's not a bad thing to have limits in communication. The question is, what are they? And how can we pay attention to those limits? And those limits, I would say, radically, even in a jungle or an ocean, certainly in a family or a society, all of those are living systems, a body, your body, my body. Those limits are formed, at least in part, through the aesthetics, the tone, the atmosphere, the vibe, the flavor, the harmonics, if you will, that are there. And so when I hear both of you speaking about love in this way, what I am hearing is, and of course, it's called warm data for a reason, right? What happens when you start to actually perceive the details of your own life, your grandmother's recipe, whatever, through all these different contexts, what happens is that you're able to actually perceive yourself and your experience, others, in a way that has a kind of integrity to it and a kind of generosity in it that I would call love. That there is something in the very nature of symbiosis that is love. That these things come together, organisms come together, and they change each other, they shape each other. The tone that happens in matters. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's a question, when you're with your kid or you're with your partner, what are you making it possible or impossible to have in your communication? Just pay attention to that. Who is it possible to be? When I'm with you, who can I be? Because I think the thing that is so sad right now is that we're limiting each other's ability to be, we're limiting each other's possibilities. And that's completely counterindicated to memes like "be the change," right? Which is going to point you right back at that individualistic, you need to, get on a higher level. Who do I allow you to be? And this is not something that is explicit. This is implicit stuff. It's in the way we are together. And you can forget how many signals and codes and, intonations and possibilities we are eliminating just in our gestures before you've said a word. And what are those limitations? So I think when we're really thinking about context, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about.
I love that. All right. Well, on that note, that was so beautiful. Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you, Stephanie, for inviting this. This was lovely. Pure doomer optimism content. I love it so much. This is very helpful to us. And I think a lot of us are grappling with these issues, I think, in our lives and work and vocation. And so a nice little beacon for our listeners to get them to keep up the good work and carry on, as many of them are doing. So thank you so much.
What else are you gonna do?
Yeah, keep going.
Right?
Keep going. All right.
Yeah. Keep going. But take the training wheels and the pedals off.
Yes.
Yeah. And then keep going.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nora. And thank you, Ashley, for being willing to host this. This was so fun.
It was really fun. It was really
great. Have a great one, everybody. Yeah. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.